Felt here, and I'm with Kelly. And today we're going to be talking about suicide, the soul, and spirit. There are some people who don't like to use the word suicide. Some people will never say that word. Some people run from that word. And it's a very scary word to some people. But it's really important to talk about what happens to people who commit suicide, or what happens to people who are successful with suicide, and what happens to the soul and what happens to the spirit of that person afterwards. I wanted to do this video because I've noticed a lot of well-meaning clerics tell people whose loved ones have committed suicides that their loved one is going to go to hell or burn in hell to the end of time, and they won't ever see them until time is over or until Christ comes, or they're going to go to purgatory and they're going to be miserable in purgatory. And I feel like these kinds of things, although said in a spirit of well-meaning, are not very helpful to the loved ones or friends of people who have committed suicides, and I include myself in that group. I also have lost friends to suicide. I feel as if those kinds of remarks are not helpful, and they're not true. And that's the reason I wanted to make this video, because I've talked to people who have committed suicide and moved on to the other side, and their souls are fine and their spirits are fine. And I'm here talking with Kelly today. Kelly has lost a brother to suicide, and we're going to be talking about what that process looks like and how her relationship with her brother has changed since he's committed suicide and gone to the other side. What does that relationship look like now, your relationship with your brother?
Well, it has changed because I'm able to communicate with him on a level that's much different than when he was here. My brother was a paranoid schizophrenic, so communication with him was very difficult. And since he's been on the other side and I've been able to communicate with him, he's enlightened. I mean, they go through this, what I've found since he's passed is that they go through this learning process that
People
God,
who commit suicide
right,
go through this learning process.
yes, because God takes them and kind of engulfs them in his love and works with them on repairing what they were unable to repair on the earth plane.
And when you say God works with them to repair what they were unable to repair on the earth plane, you're talking about their soul or their aspirations, or I'm curious about your experience with
I
this.
think repair their soul.
Yes, to repair their souls.
Mm-hmm.
There are some people who believe that a person who commits suicide has irrevocably harmed their soul and their spirit, and that there is no hereafter for those folks, or that it's a horrible hereafter. And your experience and my experience has been very different. So I want to ask you to talk a little bit more about that, if you would. After your brother died, what was that like?
The worst pain I've ever felt in my life. And I knew that this was going to happen. I felt this for years, and I always felt that I would be okay. And I wasn't prepared for the emotional turmoil. I was fortunate enough that during that time I was in my life coaching training with Debbie Ford, and I had coaches right there supporting me and helping me.
Right.
But what I found was the public wasn't up to that speed. That if you mentioned the word suicide, somehow that death was different than any other death, and they would pull away emotionally. They wouldn't give you the hug. They wouldn't support you. So I think that's where I was struggling, is that I couldn't get comforted by people.
Around your regular milieu, your regular people you worked with, or people in your neighborhood, or What about in your family? What happened in your family when your brother committed suicide?
My family was going through the same stuff I was going through, and I think
Mm-hmm.
what happened is my role in the family as the baby of the family shifted, and I became someone that was helping support not only my mother but my sister, um, and both of my sisters, and it was very different for me.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was going through the life coaching, I was able to kind of bridge that a little bit, and
So you were able to find support in your life coaching coaches,
right,
and you were able to coach your mom and your sister or sisters
sisters.
with that knowledge. So in a way, you kind of were doing like grief counseling with them.
It was more of a heart connection,
Mm-hmm.
because the life coaching kind of brings you to that heart connection,
Mm-hmm.
and it was all real. I mean, because the emotions were so to the surface, I was just able to connect with them on that emotional level. And I
Mm-hmm.
think what people in society lack when you talk about suicide, they start thinking of the stigma. They start thinking of, oh, well, you know, if, if I'm attached to the suicide, I might go to hell.
Mm-hmm.
And so they pull back their comfort. It's almost like a shock. I had an experience when I worked in the hospital. It was only like a week or so after my brother had committed suicide, and I had committed to go on this walk in Chicago for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And the security guard was helping me promote this
Security guard at the
at,
hospital where
at
you
the
worked.
hospital,
Mm-hmm.
yes. Because he'd come up and he'd talk to me, and he was very open about it. He was a young man, and he seemed to be much more open than people that are a little bit older. And the charge nurse at the time came to the floor, and he says, oh, you've got to talk to Kelly. Kelly's had this experience, and she's doing this. And she came over, and I started to explain to her what had happened.
That your brother had died from suicide.
And all of a sudden, I felt the shift in her, because I'm very empathic as well. And I
Mm-hmm.
felt her heart sink into her stomach. And she just basically looked at me, and she turned around and she walked off.
It was something that she could not deal with emotionally. It was just beyond her to be able to connect with you about that.
Yes. And my thought was, this is someone that's going to deal with people that have lost someone to suicide, and I felt very sad. I wasn't mad at her. It just was what it was.
So because she was a charge nurse, you were concerned that other people, family members, might come in contact with her, of patients on the floor who had committed suicide or tried to commit suicide,
Right.
and
And they would not receive that compassion.
because she was not able to get out of her own feelings in her body to bring um, her heart feelings forward about suicide, about death in that manner. So may I ask you, did you have any well-meaning clerics or other people that you knew in your life tell you horrible things were going to happen to your brother as a result of having committed suicide?
I didn't.
You were lucky.
Right. But I wouldn't have accepted it. I would have looked at them and said, I know better.
Hmm.
The space I was in, though, is I hadn't yet become a spiritualist.
Hmm.
And the space that I was in is I felt like he was stuck between the earth plane.
So you weren't a spiritualist yet, but you felt
Well,
like
I
he was
was
stuck
and I
between the
wasn't.
earth
Right.
plane and the other side. So you were sensing that
Right.
his body had not yet, or his spirit had not passed. I
Right.
recently had that happen myself. Actually, a friend of mine committed suicide, and we were not real close friends, but we had another friend in common, and she and I were very close. And she called me um, as soon as she found out about Caitlin having committed suicide, and um, and this friend of mine, Darlene, is not a spiritualist either. Did you notice the sun just came out as we were talking
Hmm.
about that? She's not a spiritualist either, but this was her former partner, Caitlin, had committed suicide, and she could feel her, and I could feel her stuck between. She wasn't able to move to the other side yet because there was unfinished business between her and my friend Darlene, and unfinished business as far as her being able to let go. And she was kind of this went on for like a week and a half after she passed. She would come into Darlene's house in the morning, and she was getting very irritable and impatient. She wanted us to do a ceremony. She didn't want to pass until we had done a ceremony of letting go. And so sometimes that does happen. They're sometimes stuck in between, and you have to do stuff to release him. So what did you do to release him, to allow him to move on?
I really think it was just a fear of mine. I don't think that I was actually accurate on that. Um, but I felt, I was very fearful that that's what was going on.
You were fearful that he was stuck, and you don't think he actually was.
Right. And so I was guided to start going, and I started going to the Augusta Spiritualist Church. And started going there for comfort. And I'd been going there for, I don't know, it was quite a while, and I kept wanting to get a message from my brother. I kept wanting, and I'd go every week, and I wouldn't get a message. And I finally said to Vaco, who was the pastor at the time, I said, I don't understand. Why am I not getting a message? And he said, well, sometimes it takes them a while to come through.
That's true.
And so I was taking classes, and the meditation classes, and the person leading the class said, your guide's going to take you on a journey, and you get to ask them whatever you want. And I was very new to this at the time, although I've been spiritual
so this was a
my
guided
entire
meditation.
life. Right.
Yes.
And I've been spiritual my entire life, but I hadn't had this level of contact with things as spiritualism is. And so I asked my guide, I said, I want to talk to my brother. And I was led to this kind of...
In the meditation,
Yeah.
you were led to a place.
Yeah, up in the clouds. It was kind of like clouds. It was very different. And my brother came to me. And for some reason, he had us in a circle of candles. And we're standing there, and he's talking to me, and he says, I'm okay, and I'm learning. And we had a little bit more of a conversation, but that's what stuck with me, is I'm okay, and I'm learning. And of course, being someone that is skeptical, I said to the person leading the class, I said, what is my wanting, is it just my wanting to speak with him that I'm getting in this meditation, or is this actually he's speaking to me? And he really couldn't give me an answer. But the next week, after sharing this with my daughter and saying, this is what I got, and I felt pretty good about it. I'm trying to think of the woman's name. I believe her name is Gloria Nye.
I know Gloria Nye, yes.
Okay. She came from a southern church, southern Maine, and I had never met her. And in the middle of giving mediumship, she goes, I have to stop. There's a Jim or a James, and he is bothering me. He will not stop until he gets this message out. And I said, yeah, that's me. And she came to me, and she says, he just wants you to know that he's okay and he's learning.
The exact same words that you got in the guided meditation.
And of course, that reduced me to tears, my daughter to tears.
Validation.
Because I had spoke this to my daughter.
Yes.
Clear validation. Clear validation that is exactly what's happening. And of course, my relationship with my brother has continued. I've been able to communicate with him, and other mediums have brought him through. So I feel comfortable that he is in the best place.
And he's learning. Yes. I have seen before sometimes some of the clients whose loved ones have come in to me. I've seen that when it's very sudden, for instance, I've had a couple of clients whose young adult children in high school had shot themselves. And when that happens, it seems like there's a great shock to the system, and they're sort of vibrating, and it takes them longer to get reacclimated to the spirit side, to be able to connect with us. And it's interesting to me that that if you don't have contact with someone who's committed suicide, say within about 6 months after that person passes, then you pretty much know that perhaps things are not quite right and you need to get a little help. You might need to do a little healing work around that. It's interesting that you say that your brother appeared in a circle of candles. I wonder if you lit candles for him or if someone else in the family was doing that. Yeah. So that makes perfect sense to me. I actually have a video on YouTube about that. That's called Saying Prayers for Our Loved Ones who have passed and helping them to acclimate to the other side. And I found that lighting candles with their pictures in back of them and things that they loved, whatever the cause of death might be, I found that lighting that kind of helps them to acclimate to the spirit side of life, and it does heal them. It does help them to move on a little faster. So can I ask you,
Hmm.
for the camera here, what would you say to someone um, who has just found out that their friend's husband or wife or son or daughter or brother or sister has committed suicide? What would you tell them to do? How could they help you? Like this charge nurse who was not able to connect with you or be there around the situation. What would you say to those people? Um, how can they help people who are dealing with suicide?
I would just say comfort them. I mean, really
Comfort them?
comfort the people. And
Do they need to be there for you to be able to say the word suicide too?
absolutely. And one of the things that I learned through this process was that not only do people that have lost someone to suicide want to talk about suicide, but they want to talk about every single aspect of the death. And that was one of the things that I went through. I had to know every single detail. And my mother was doing the same thing. But what I was doing is I was kind of protecting her. I was going through and getting the reports from the coroner and kind of buffering it for my mom.
Mm-hmm.
But I had to know every detail because I had to know how he died.
Yes.
I had to know what that process was.
Um, did you struggle with thinking that you should have been able to do something?
Absolutely.
And did you need to talk about that to your friends? Did you need them to listen to you say that you wished you could have done something or that you thought that you could have?
I did. And my friend Marianne Wade, who's a coach, um, was so pivotal in my healing. And it was so hard for her because some of the things that she had to say um, to me and to help me to understand it and to accept what had happened was very difficult for her to speak.
Mm-hmm.
I remember her being on the other side of the phone crying, saying, "This is so difficult for me, but you have to get this.
So
You have to
friends
get
need
it."
to, even if it's difficult, it's helpful, even if your friends are crying and they're having a hard time, for them to reach out to you and say, um, it's going to be okay, and I'm listening, and you need to know this, so you need to know that, or whatever um, they feel they need to share with you about this process,
Absolutely.
but not to tell you how to feel.
Right. And, as a trained coach, she was able to really work with me on
Right,
what I needed to surface. And
right.
it's very unique compared to what a friend would do. But in the coaching, it led me to acceptance. And the ironic part is I was working through a coaching process called spiritual divorce.
Uh-huh.
And I found that this coaching was very good for helping people that have been through a death and to help them with their grieving.
Mm-hmm.
And I have worked with a few people that have lost people to suicide through
Right.
this coaching. I absolutely will not work with them until they're 6 months out because they have to go through the natural grieving process. But it's a way to move them forward. I find people that have lost someone to suicide sometimes are still carrying that 20 years later.
That's true. That's true. I also want to suggest that people consider seeing a licensed grief counselor as well if they have not been able to resolve the issues. And suicide, to me, I think it's one of it may be the hardest kind of death to come to terms with for family members. Um,
But also you have to remember that not all therapists are a fit. So I would recommend making sure that that person is a fit for you
Exactly.
Because if they can't be there for you and help you through the process, then you need to find a therapist that can.
That's very important. The other thing that I think can be very helpful is um, support group for survivors of suicide. They're actually called SOS groups, and they're all over the United States, and they help people who are having to deal with the loss of a loved one. I recently saw some research that says that suicidality and suicide may be a brain disorder that up until now has not been identified, or a mental health disorder that up until now has not been identified. They're doing research on that. Um, and so people need to know that the change is in the brain, and there's nothing you as a loved one can do about that. The change is in the brain. So,
There's nothing you can do.
no, there's nothing you can do to shift that.
And it may be something for you to learn too. I mean, that was the biggest learning piece probably of my life.
So there was a gift in that experience for you, even though it was a horrible, horrible experience. Well, I know that we've gone a little bit over time than we usually do for these videos, but this seemed very important. It seemed very important to talk about that a person's spirit and a person's soul goes on after they've committed suicide. They don't go to hell. They don't burn in fire. They don't go to purgatory. Several different things can occur to the soul, but there are loved ones on the other side and guides on the other side that are helping them to reacclimate to the spirit side of life and to resolve their issues, and be able to move forward with a healed soul. And you can still make contact with them and still have a relationship with them, although it will look different than it was when they were here on the earth plane. You can still talk to your brother and still feel connected with him. It's at a different level now.
It's a better level.
Yes.
It really is.
It's a far better level if he was paranoid schizophrenic before.
His life was miserable.
Yes.
And who would want that? I mean, I wouldn't want him living like that.
Yes. So thank you for sharing with us, Kelly. I
You're
appreciate
welcome.
it, and thank you to our viewers for sticking with us this long.